Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are looking forward to this exciting webinar on day 2 of the CAPI webinar series, More and Better with Less, Sustainable Intensification in Agriculture, presented by today's sponsor, Fertilizer Canada. Je suis Tyler McCann et je suis le dirigeant principal de la mobilisation et du développement des affaires de l'ICPA. If you missed day 1's webinar, which covered the leading science behind sustainable intensification, please check it out on our YouTube channel, and it will soon be on CAPI's website at www.capi-icpa.ca. It is a great companion to our discussion today on the business of sustainable intensification, and important food for thought for those interested in agriculture, climate policy, and the need to produce more and better with less. L'ICPA est un institut qui dirige, catalyse et coordonne des analyses stratégiques indépendantes sur les nouveaux enjeux agroalimentaires, engage de dialogue avec les intervenants et fait progresser les politiques publiques. CAPI focuses solely on the agri-food sector, bringing insight, evidence, and creative solutions to agri-food policymakers by creating venues for critical conversations, explaining research results to a broader audience, and being a connector between those who have creative ideas to contribute and those who are making impactful policy decisions. La meilleure façon de s'impliquer avec l'ICPA, c'est de devenir notre partenaire. Individuals, organizations, and associations can support the work we do through our registered charity, the Canadian Agri-Food Foundation, which supports the work of CAPI. Your commitment is vital, as it is urgent to intensify our efforts as agriculture and agri-food can be essential solution providers for the economy, the environment, health, food, and global security, but creative policy changes are essential. Connect through the info email located at the bottom right of the screen. I would like to thank our sponsor for today's webinar, Fertilizer Canada, and I invite Cassandra Cotton, Vice President of Policy and Programs at Fertilizer Canada, to say a few words. Over to you, Cassandra.
Thanks so much. Welcome, everyone. And thank you to CAPI for the opportunity to sponsor this session. I think this conversation has never been more important in the policy arena than it is today. We all know that in order for Canada to achieve or exceed our export potential, Canadian farmers need to continue to increase their productivity. And while farmers are being called upon to increase their yields, of which fertilizer is responsible for 50%, they're also being asked to decrease their environmental impact. And so reconciling the dual objectives of increased food production and reduced emissions is actually something that industry has been working on for well over a decade. And we believe that what's missing is the accounting of these practices. The real challenge, I think, is that government hasn't been able to move at the speed of business to actually enable things like the Barton Report to become a reality, or to meet some of the ambitious environmental targets. Farmers and industry prospers when there's a regulatory and policy environment that fosters investment and innovation. And so looking forward to the discussion today as it relates to what kind of policies would enable that. We believe that those policies need to reward farmers and not punish them. Stopping positioning agriculture as an emitter and identifying its potential as a carbon sink. As was so eloquently identified in the previous webinar to this series, things like the national inventory doesn't actually present an accurate estimate of the nitrous oxide emissions in Canada from agriculture. And so there are existing solutions that I think industry has implemented that the government needs to prioritize to help meet these targets and respond to an increase in carbon price that could prove to be an incentive. I think Canadian farmers and the fertilizer industry are ready to turn carbon from a liability into an asset. And what's needed is a policy and regulatory space that ensures that the economy and the environment go hand in hand. So I look forward to the discussion today and the outcomes from this exciting series. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Cassandra, and thank you again to Fertilizer Canada for sponsoring our webinar today. Before we officially begin today's program and I pass things over to our moderator, we have a few housekeeping items to review. During the webinar, participant audio and video will be turned off. As an attendee, you cannot be seen or heard by others. Participants can submit questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of their screens. Due to time limits, the moderator may not be able to ask all questions submitted. The webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all participants and posted on our YouTube channel. If you are posting about the webinar on social media, please use the hashtag #MoreBetterLess. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Mr. David Dizziak. David has been Chief Operating Officer of Batenko since April of 2019. David grew up on a family farm, a family grain farm in Dauphin, Manitoba. He graduated from the University of Manitoba with a degree in agriculture. He enjoyed a 38 career with Dow AgroSciences with experiences in sales management, marketing management, and global business leadership in the canola and oilseeds group. David served on the board and as chair of the Canola Council of Canada. He was deeply involved in the design of the winning application for the Protein Industries Canada Supercluster and currently serves on the PIC board. He also works on the mentorship committee for the Plant-Based Foods Canada. And with that, I will pass it over to you, David.
Hey, thank you very much, Tyler, and good morning to everybody. Again, I'm David Dizziak here in Calgary with Botanico, and I'm pleased to be the moderator on this really timely and important series on sustainable intensification. Climate change is affecting everybody. You know, my neighbor's young son said to me yesterday, he says, you know, Mr. Dizziak, we haven't found a solution for climate change, but we're definitely getting warmer. So that's my climate joke for the day. But with that, let's start the session. For the morning's webinar, we have an opening presentation followed by a panel discussion. Our panelists today include Brian McConkey, Chief Scientist at Foresco Solutions, Ann Wasco, she's the Market Analyst at Gateway Livestock Exchange, and Sarah Fedorchuk, who's the Vice President for Government and Public Affairs for North America for the Mosaic Company. First, though, I'd like to tie back to some of the important outcomes or points that were made on the first session here on Tuesday. I think the stage was set with a global perspective that we need to double our food production, but do it with 65% less carbon. So that's quite a challenge for an industry. I really like the notion that was brought up of discussing and understanding the need to understand the carbon value of our land. I think the most important point that came out was that this can only really be solved by innovation. We need to create new innovation systems and approaches that's going to involve everybody across the ag value chain. So Tuesday's session really opened up new doors for new policy ideas and discussions. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Canada's carbon accountant, Brian McConkey, to provide his opening presentation. Brian?
Yeah, thanks, and good morning, everyone. And yeah, I'm really pleased to have been invited by Cappy to make this presentation. Yeah, I'm going to talk about, sustainable intensification. How do we evaluate it and how do we pay for it? But really, again, I'll be talking primarily, I'll really be using greenhouse gas as a sort of the measure of sustainability. So, I mean, as has been pointed out, agriculture is definitely under pressure. We've got this huge challenge to meet future food needs. We have to increase that production on the same or even less land and use that land that we're not using for agriculture for other purposes like forests and other natural habitat. We have to become more efficient in terms of how we use non-renewable resources and also to cause less environmental harm. And also important for the pressures on agriculture is that we see increasingly more and more in those net zero targets. Well, we can't, in an overall economy, get rid of all greenhouse gas emissions. Even if you have all electric vehicles, there's still emissions in making them and whatever. So, it really means net zero means you need a sink. You need some kind of greenhouse gas sink, and that's something, that agriculture can offer. So that means that, the world and the economy is looking to agriculture. So as I said, I'm going to be using greenhouse gas reduction, greenhouse gas efficient production as sort of a placeholder for environmental sustainability. So I talked a lot in say this is about environmental sustainability because I do think that we need to, broaden out over the time to really think of, the whole broader suite of environmental sustainability. in with regard to agriculture and the economy. But I think greenhouse gases will, lead the way for environmental sustainability becoming mainstream across the value chain. And again, just to remember, sustainability is of course a very complex issue, and greenhouse gases, even in terms of environment, are really just a small part of sustainability when you consider the rural community, the economics, and of course all the other aspects of the environment, like soil quality and water quality and things that are affected and affect agriculture. So I think I've been in this business, I guess, of looking at greenhouse gases for too many decades. But so when I look back, everything was about what's government policy. Policy was entirely about government policy. And at best, businesses aligned their private policies regarding the environment to those of governments. But now I see, the big change that's happened around the world. In Canada has been that now private policy is now leading, I think, on many cases on the environment, and is ahead of governments, and also private policy is not necessarily aligned with government policy. And I think that the example that that really struck me when it was announced was Bayer was launching this major carbon program with farmers, and they picked two countries to do it, and this was in mid 2020 was the US and Brazil. Well, at that time, of course, Trump was president, Bolsonaro president in Brazil, both administrations very anti-climate change. Why so here was a major multi-million-dollar investment, maybe tens of or hundreds of millions of dollar investment going into climate change with agriculture in two jurisdictions, countries where in fact climate change wasn't a government priority. So I mean, it really just shows how that there's no longer that kind of alignment. It wasn't like they were looking for countries that were supportive of this kind of thing. They were looking for countries that could get the job done in terms of meeting their pledges and seeing also business opportunities for carbon capture with them on farmland. And of course, we see many other initiatives by industry that in many cases is leading science-based targets, where companies will look and say, oh, how do I get to what do I have to do in my business to get to 2 degrees? And we also see Maple Leaf saying we're going to be the first carbon neutral food company, and so it's really changing. We're also seeing actual investment going into particular agricultural practices such as regenerative agriculture, with incentives and funding, and that's both in the U.S. and Canada. So this is a real change, and of course we're also seeing, of course, the sector in terms of working across the multiple stakeholders in the value chain. You can look at the Canadian Roundtable Sustainable Beef, Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops. It's really good examples, and also where government was specifically kept out of any decision-making role in those roundtables. I mean, it could participate, but not in a decision-making capacity. So, that really, again, how industry is going. And of course, recently, this month we've seen, again, more collaboration and alliance among a number of major farm organizations to work on Canadian, to coordinate the role of the Canadian economy. So you see this, and I think in some ways you can see the federal government in particular is really just playing catch up now. And so I look at the mandates letter to the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food, and the first, or the minute, coming off the last federal election, there was not one word on climate change. As far as the government was concerned, agriculture don't have anything to do. You don't have to worry about climate change. It's not an issue. Now we see the update to that mandate, and it definitely puts climate change in, gives agriculture and agri-food Canada said, you've got a role in this. You've got to do work on this. And the Pan-Canadian framework, there was a few weasel words in there about agriculture and how it might, especially with sinks, could play a role, but there was no targets or identified actions. And then suddenly, just last December. Then you start to see, more specific actions related to agriculture with setting up a national emission reduction target for fertilizer emissions, and also, making it's a token investment, but actually putting money for Natural Climate Solutions Fund for agriculture. So, you really begin to see, so while our industry was already well ahead of this, the federal government, in particular in Canada, is playing catch up. So, how do we make environmental sustainability mainstream? And I guess, the first thing, and no surprises, we've got to sort of target in, identify those, or develop them, or even improve them, those production systems that, have, in terms of the sustainability, are acceptable from a socially and economically, but that move in the direction of less use of finite resources and less environmental harm. So, I mean, that's obviously the first part of it. You got to say, what do we need to do in order to move towards, reduced, in this case, really, we're focusing really on net reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And then the second thing is we've got to somehow incentivize these things. And, we're all used to that, there's the carrot and the stick. And so that, on the carrot side, there's, we can just say persuasion, just where sustainability becomes an attribute of production. It's how you produce, but it's part of the production. And so I'll give some examples, persuading how you move there. Another one, and a different one, is where purchase, where now suddenly sustainability is its own saleable product or service. So agriculture is now offering sustainability as a product. So it's separate from the traditional agricultural products. It's not tied to them. Or of course, we can always have regulation, sustainability as an imposed obligation. And so just, some examples sort of on that, making it an attribute of production is, I mean, we've seen this in every advertisement, everything, you appeal to alignment with some personal values, whether because the systems are more profitable, people love nature, they have pride in their operation, pride in their sector, they want to enhance their standing in the community, and et cetera, et cetera. Or you can offer a price premium or preferred market access for ag products that can be documented to be produced more sustainably. So there are, some price premiums for canola that's going into the European biodiesel market, based on the low environmental footprint of Canadian production. And also that gives it access to that premium market. Or we can put taxes like carbon taxes that are directed to try to reduce undesired behavior. So again, that's just more a kind of a method of persuasion. Or we can have subsidies or payments linked to the desired payment. But on the purchase side, then it's really the main one. Payment for provision of environmental goods or services, which is seller that has future obligations for continual delivery. So it's sort of the offsets. Whatever. So, carbon offsets would be, the key example, but there could also be things like conservation agreements where, an investment is made to conserve the land in a particular thing. And of course, we can also have regulations, and we do have many, like land use restrictions on how you use different inputs, penalties for causing environmental harm. And I think we're pretty sort of familiar and understand, the persuasion and the regulation side of things, so those have always been in play. But the purchase of sustainability is something new, and so we can. So I wanted to break that down a little bit more. So we have the purchase of a specified quantity of some sort of good or service, and that can be done through what's called offsets, and that's certainly probably everyone is somewhat familiar with that, where the emission reduction is done external to your operations, or at least this is from the buyer's perspective, and they may not be even connected at all, but that reduces the emissions for the final purchaser. So I guess in agriculture would be the seller, and someone else, whoever the final purchasers, can then use that. And insets is different though. I mean, essentially it's similar, except that it's really but you're really looking now within your suppliers or your customers as well, and saying, how can I reduce or what kind of emission reductions? So you're reducing the quantity but in a relationship with closely connected businesses. So if you're a buyer of agricultural products, it's making those reductions in your supply chain is as important as trying to do them in your own operation. And it's in some ways more transparent. It lowers the greenhouse gas emissions from your products. Because why I say transparently, because I mean, if you buy someone plants a forest in Ecuador and you buy offsets from that, and then you say, well, now my beef has a lower greenhouse gas emission because of that. Well, I guess, yeah, we do the accounting, it works out. But if you say, oh, I've made investments for more use of additives in feedlots, that supplies my beef, then, it's quite clear. Okay, yeah, obviously, yeah, I can see that, yeah, you definitely reduce the emissions from your products, and it's more transparent how that's done. But you can also have, of course, purchases where you don't specify the quantity. And this, again, especially with conservation agreements, you may find that, they won't use that as to reduce their own emissions. They can't use it as an offset. They might claim, there's so many emission reductions because we protected this land from being deforested or whatever. But I mean, they're not using it, so it's a little bit different. So the offset markets, it's complicated. You've got the voluntary markets, and it's still basically the Wild West. In many ways, you've got the protocols create the offset credits, and those protocols can vary hugely in the different rules about eligibility, what's called additionality, whether this reduction would have occurred anyways, how third-party verification, and certainly for carbon permanence, those things can really change among protocols, and that changes the perceived value of the credits that are created and also the cost to implement them. And I guess there's three kind of big players there that are really respected registries in this space, and have played a major role. And we even have, like the Canadian Climate Action Reserve has has the Canadian Canadian protocol for avoidance of grassland conversion. So there's a case where we've got Canadian specific protocol coming from the Climate Action for the voluntary market. Then you can have regulated markets where a government body provides oversight. In this case, it's pretty much always third-party verification is required. There's no competing protocols in that market. So again, the voluntary market, you could, if you're looking on the market for carbon offsets, you can kind of pick a whole bunch. But here now, if you're regulated, then you really don't have any. You just have one. The set is picked, and the Alberta government's offset system is an important example, and also the government of Canada is building up a system now, but it's kind of delayed. I guess the inset versus the offset. I mean, the big difference between an offset is because it's not really connected with your business. It's really it's like a license to emit, right? So the integrity of it is really needs a high level of integrity. So usually has very strict rules, especially around additionality and permanence. They're quite strict, and that gives it integrity, but also makes it more limits, I guess, the available insets. These are where registries have putting in insets, and you find that the rules of additionality are less strict. Because there's already this strong existing connection, shared interest that provides more inherent integrity, and is more focused on achieving net emission reductions. So additionality is not important. So for example, under the VERA as a protocol for improved land management, if anything hits 20% of the 20% of the land in that area is in that practice, then any additional thing is just considered to be, that's just automatic. You can't get credit for that in an offset. But in an inset, then it would really be different. You'd say, well, look, I'm making this investment with my supply to enhance cover crops and going beyond the 20%, but you're still making net reductions, and so that's still would be more allowed, essentially allowed under insets, because it's just the nature of it. And of course, you also have these existing relationships, so it makes it easier to you know, to involve primary agriculture, because most of the emissions, whether you're selling products that are used on the farm or buying from the farm, you know, emissions in that whole your whole value chain really are coming a lot of them from the farm gate. And also, you've already got a relationship with many farmers, so it's easier to recruit them into a system. So it's not surprising that a company like Bayer and Indigo Ag, a big economic consulting firm in the U.S., both of them have major carbon projects because they've already got the relationship with a lot of growers, and because particularly on the crop side there. So how do we evaluate sustainability? I mean, the first way is pretty simple. It's really what's called practice-based. So you find the practice and relate environmental sustainability outcome to that practice, and we're pretty familiar with that. So here's a rate of carbon change per acre with adoption of no-till from reduced till. The pros, it's certainly simple to apply, but also importantly, it's also simple to verify. It's very easy to verify that, in fact, well, not easy, but it's possible to verify that you've done no-till and you were doing reduced till in the past. But the cons are, you know, the relationship between the practice and the outcome may be poor. The actions that reduce anything that reduce emissions but don't fall into that practice recipe list, if you like, are not considered. So, you know, it doesn't lead to a lot of innovation. And it's not deal well with complex systems where the practices are not easily defined and are very considerably over time. It makes verifying and estimating outcome difficult. And a good example of that is grazing systems, which you get into it, they become very complex because of weather and changing the herd size and markets and everything. You know, it can change radically. So it's really hard to define what exactly is the practice and then to verify that practice was done, and then also to relate an outcome to that practice. But we're used with the practice format. The field print platform is used by many companies that have put a lot of resources in this to help against the supply chain, particularly farmers, to document their sustainability. There's a Canadian field print calculator built, you know, kind of based on the field print that again provides, you know, again, as you can see, some sustainability indicators in a number of areas. And then we also move to, at least on the greenhouse gas side, you know, much more complex systems, the Cool Farm tool, and then also importantly the Holus model from AAFC to provide more of a more complex sort of quantification, but still really based when you drill down into it, really on the different practices that are involved in the system. So the other alternative is outcome based, where you quantify the outcome directly, and that again supports innovation because you're just measuring whatever is done that can achieve this is valuable. So you know you don't have a recipe list, and so it helps, you know. And it's possible for some things, like if you were trying to pick a particular species at risk, you could sort of measure that, or at least measure the type of habitat that particular species needs. Or you can arguably, I guess, you do soil organic carbon change, but for many others, you know, general biodiversity, nitrous oxide emissions, methane emissions, it's really just too costly or too complicated to do that on every farm. So it really, limits, I guess, the capability of doing it. But, you know, I think we're seeing, you know, increased capabilities, remote sensing and low cost sensors, proximal sensors that can be, you know, in the field measure soil moisture, soil carbon, nutrients. You know, maybe there's some talk of things that can even do greenhouse gas fluxes, you know, and even if they don't do them accurately enough to sort of be a perfect measure of some of these quantities, I mean, they can still be very powerful to inform models and systems that can make those estimates, but it certainly allows them for spatially and temporally detailed data that can be used as input to better estimate environmental outcomes from the individual farm, and also provides, you know, measured indicators that that practices have been implemented. You know, that you can see that yes, you've changed the nutrient balance and so on, and it's an important area of research both in the public and private sector. So there's intense interest in outcome-based evaluation because there's really a lot of skepticism still about net greenhouse gas reductions from agriculture. And it seems more logical to try to measure this because in many other areas, like certainly in industrial processes, you really depend on measurements. But do you measure purposefully, or are you just measuring because you can? I looked through the Vera Improved Land Management Protocol that's released last fall. There's much interest. It's applicable in Canada. It could be used in Canada, but you have to model the carbon because all your reductions are against a baseline of what would have been. Well, of course, that baseline is counterfactual, so you have to model it. But it also requires measurements of carbon over the whole project, quite detailed measurements of carbon over the whole project, at least every 5 years for a true up. And there's a deduction to the overall credit if soil carbon isn't estimated accurately. But the other greenhouse gases, because you can't measure them, you just use general equations and there's no deduction for the accuracy. So there's this huge cost being required against the soil carbon measurement. It kind of threatens the viability of projects. And to me anyways, it doesn't seem to be a compelling justification when you essentially have to model kind of half the answer has to be modeled anyways. It really, I think just because you can measure something that isn't a reason to measure. So what would we need then to provide us with this outcome estimator? And it's really maybe, you can probably think of it as, for those that are familiar with the HOLUS model, you can think of it as HOLUS on steroids, where you're now putting in much more data and also, as that data is coming, so it's changing over time. So you put weather, you have a lot of remote sense data. Of course, you'd still have to have specific farm management data, but you may have different proximal sensors that may measure things like, the nutrients, so that, you're saying I'm doing 4NR fertilizer, management practices, or 4R fertilizer management practices. Well, this then starts to provide that evidence that, you're not seeing a lot of, nitrates building in the soil at any one time, particularly when the crop isn't growing. And you may have to inform it, of course, with data from research, but you may also, say, well, especially if you have a large, offset project, to say, well, maybe I need some detailed measurements on selected farms in that project to really inform this system. And of course, I also bring in available soils data, and then putting all that together with both synthesizing data and models, and really coming up with much better quality estimators. And I think thinking again towards broader environmental sustainability, can stack environmental goods and services as well. So this quantification system, you can expand it to include other environmental goods and services, because again, finding the relationships between things you do know that's happening on the farm, and through research and detailed observation, how that relates to the goods and services that you're interested in. Then you can simply stack these up, and this is often thought that greenhouse gas might be kind of the platform, in a sense. It pays for a lot of this, and then you add these other things on, and only adds extra value for agriculture in terms of providing important environmental goods and services. And of course, that also, the same quantification system could just support documentation for certification, market access, or even just marketing, and making your product more attractive. And then, and also this is, this same system, of course, could also help with farm management, because you can't measure what you can't measure. Well, maybe we can't measure greenhouse gas, but if we had a more farm-specific quantification that can take into account some of the complexities that are going on in an individual operation, then that allows that, as well as, of course, by the way, of course, it's going to also have to estimate crop yields and other important economic performance, in a sense, to be able to do its job doing on the environmental goods and services. So, it starts to become kind of a system for managing for other purposes as well. So, Jen, just to summarize, sorry. Okay, I guess maybe I'm running out of time, which is good because I'm at the end. But just that, we've got to, how do we feed the world without overwhelming the capacity? And that need, what we're really saying is really increasing the collaboration and investment, especially in the private sector. I think there's really, again, that there's been just a sea change, I would say, in the last 5 years in terms of the amount that's happening there. And that's going to, and that's directed towards improving the of agriculture. And it's typically one of the larger emitters bidders, I can see this kind of insetting concept in general ways is so that it's primary agriculture is considered investment decision making for anyone in the food value chain uh, regarding environmental sustainability, and that's going to be a major improvement. And then finally, I mean, quantifying the greenhouse gas emissions accurately for complex farming systems is a challenge, but it's necessary to attract the investment, both public and private investment, to make the case for making those investments to increase environmental sustainability of agriculture. So, yeah, thank you.
That was great, Brian. Thank you very much. That was a really good perspective, and it really helps feed to think some of the policy discussions and approaches that are going to have to happen later on. Now I'd like to bring in our other panelists. We've got Ann Wasko and Sarah Fedorchuk present some opening remarks, and I'll turn it over to you, Ann.
Okay, thanks, David. And thank you to Cappy for inviting me to join you today. I think Edmund is going to put up my presentation. I've just got a few comments to make. Again, following up on Brian's great presentation. And certainly, as he's been referenced to, the accounting piece of carbon counting. I am Ann Wasko. I'm the chair of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. And I also wear the hat as a rancher. Our family farms ranches in Southwest Saskatchewan. And I'm also a market analyst by profession. I do want to talk a little bit about the CRSB, the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef today, because I think it fits this conversation really well. For those of you not familiar with the CRSB, we were formed in 2014. It's a multi-stakeholder, not-for-profit organization. And again, the mission to advance Canadian beef industry sustainability. How we do that? Through multi-stakeholder engagement, collaboration, communications, and science. We essentially bring organizations together from across the beef value chain and certainly work on areas of common interest. This is a slide of our membership. As I mentioned, we are a membership-based organization, and you can see the broadness of the type of members. We've got over 110 members currently. They range from observers, beef producers, processors, retail, food service, NGOs, food and ag business, academic institutions, and others that certainly want to join and commit to the mission of the CRSB and sustainability. We work in 3 areas, basically: benchmarking, certification, and projects. And today, in light of the conversation we're having with this webinar, I do want to highlight our benchmarking work, because the conversation is certainly around sustainable intensification. To us at the CRSB, that means measure, collaborate, and improve. And again, our benchmarking work focuses on assessing sustainability performance, so that's our measuring, setting a strategy, that's the collaboration piece with our membership, and establishing long-term goals for improvement. And industry has recently and is in the process of setting goals out to 2030, which I'll talk about in a second. Our life cycle assessment was conducted originally by Deloitte LLC, and it has given us the science-based information about Canada's beef sustainability performance from farm to fork. This is different than the global beef performance measure that you may have heard about before, and it doesn't just focus on greenhouse gas emissions, but really is a comprehensive systems view. The beef industry accounts for 2.4% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, which is less than half of the world's average. And it plays a critical role in environmental conservation, with 44 million acres of grasslands in the care of beef producers. This is a globally endangered ecosystem, and by fact, stores about 1.5 billion tons of carbon and provides habitat for over 1,000 species of plants, animals, insects, 60 of which are currently at risk of extinction. The industry, as I mentioned, has set goals, and we're on a strategy for continual improvement. The Canadian Beef Advisors, which is a group of the 7 national beef organizations, have all come together and developed these long-term goals. The goals include reducing primary production greenhouse gas intensity by 33%, at the same time maintaining the 35 million acres of native grassland and sequestering an additional 3.4 million tons of carbon each year in our 9 million acres of tame pasture. We've also set a goal to reduce food waste by 50%, which aligns with the National Zero Waste Council's goal. Second Harvest, which is Canada's largest food rescue charity, launched a report entitled The Avoidable Crisis of Food Waste in 2019 and found nearly 60% of food produced in Canada is lost or wasted. So we've got a lot of work to do in that arena. The goals we've set highlight the work of the Canadian beef industry as integral for climate change mitigation and the sustainability of our food system. Building support from government and public trust is based on doing the right things for our land, our animals, and our environment. The expectation that these ambitious goals result in innovation in the beef industry and solidify our place as part of that climate solution. One of the examples for sustainable intensification in the beef sector I would point to is likely in the area of carbon sequestration. Research has shown us that depending on the region, soil type, rainfall, tame pastures can be managed more intensively, thereby sequestering more carbon and producing more beef on less land. This system does require daily or even hourly moving of fences, for example, so certainly is more intensive from a management perspective, not just intensive on a livestock perspective. Another example I'd point to in terms of some of the opportunities I see would be in our feedlots. The feedlot sector in Canada is certainly sustainable through reduced days required overall to finish cattle and using high quality feedstuffs that are not suitable for human consumption and overall feed efficiency, all of these leading to reduced greenhouse gas emissions. I would arguably suggest that the Canadian feedlot sector has moved the needle the most to date in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas footprint. So in the case of the Canadian beef industry, intensification can occur while at the same time reducing our emissions, storing more carbon, and conserving the environment. I'll just finish up here with a couple of pictures from our ranch in Southwest Saskatchewan, East End, Saskatchewan to be exact. We operate in the Northern Great Plains grassland, meaning most of our ranch is native grassland and an endangered ecosystem, as you've heard. We are in a semi-arid climate region, receiving less than 10 inches of rainfall precipitation each year. That means we're constantly drought proofing and managing our grass and soil. We need to be proactive. We can't manage a drought once we're in a drought, or otherwise we're selling off cows. So we see ourselves as producers as a solutions provider and want to raise public awareness of our excellent sustainability performance and the numerous environmental benefits of beef in Canada. We are committed to improvement. We are proud of the beef we produce and feed Canadians and those around the world. And I think I just got the one thank you slide to finish up. There's some contact information, but I look forward to being part of the panel discussions and questions as we go. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ann. That was a really great perspective on the cattle industry and how it can be part of the solution. Next, I'd like to bring in Sarah Fedorchuk with the Mosaic Company. Please go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you. And I do not have any slides today, and I'll try to keep my intro a little brief just so we can get to all the great questions I see on the Q&A. But Mosaic is the world's largest producer of potash and phosphate fertilizer. We're traded on the New York Stock Exchange. The entirety of our potash business is located in Saskatchewan, and a huge chunk of our phosphate business is located in Central Florida. So we have jurisdictions across the world where we're operating and deal with governments and different public policy realms all of the time. So globally, fertilizer contributes to 40 to 60% of crop yields. And it's just a vital component to sustainable intensification of ag lands. What we've seen over the last decade is just an increased focus from ourselves, our competitors, and different places up and down our supply chain on the 4R nutrient stewardship program. It's a science-based framework that uses the right nutrient source with the right rate at the right time and in the right place. And we've been working, and we actually have public goals stating this, that we've been advancing and accelerating the adoption of 4Rs in North America and in our other jurisdictions over the last decade. And today, through validated programs such as the 4R and 4R certification, we've adopted 7 million acres, and our ESG goal, environmental social governance goal that we've stated publicly, is to have 25% increase in growers' profits through 4R nutrient stewardship by as much as $87 per acre. And just for an example, applying the 4R in Ontario in corn production can increase yields by 20%. And US farmers have more than doubled their corn production just using 6.9% more fertilizer since 1980. So we think that this is a key path to future sustainability in ag. We think that's an important conversation that we should be having now. And we've been engaging with governments and stakeholders all over the place to try to kind of tell this story and get further buy-in for the 4R nutrient stewardship program. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sarah. That was, again, really informative too. And obviously the fertilizer industry has a huge role to play in helping to advance this agenda here. So let's move into the Q&A part of the session. And I've got a couple, 3 lead questions, and just be mindful because of time, we can be crisp on the answer. I want to get to some of the questions that have come up from the audience that's participating today. So the first question is really to take a look at the Government of Canada climate change policies. So could you quickly share a perspective on what you think is working and what the gaps are for agriculture and the implications of that? Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, so I think what has been working is certainly, one thing, at least the government has kept the conversation on greenhouse gases and the importance of climate change. So I think that's good. Where it's failed, I think, is they haven't provided the sort of on-ramps of how agriculture can get involved in the solution space. And I talked about a bit about that in my talk. That really sort of left out of the planning, and so and right now we need offsets badly if we're going to and then that's a slow process, and that should have been sped up, or should have been foreseen that this would become important. And the other thing is, in some ways, the carbon tax, which is of course a mechanism of trying to change behaviors by reducing reducing emissions. It's been controversial, obviously, within the farm sector, and I guess you could say it really hasn't been effective, I guess, in that alone in changing behaviors, nor in some ways has it changed probably a lot of other behaviors in the overall economy. And part of that, I guess, is just the problem with carbon tax. You have to make it hurt, in other words, to change behaviors. And of course, that's kind of a difficult, if you're trying to get elected, making people hurt isn't necessarily a good tactic. So there's problems there. So I think and really it's only been when they've taken on put strong targets to particular industries, like getting rid of coal production, that's really doing all the heavy lifting right now in terms of reducing Canada's greenhouse gas emissions by stopping coal use for power generation. So we really need so it really shows that government can do a lot, but they really got to think quicker and act quicker and be more responsive to the opportunities that are there to help facilitate, support them.
Thanks, Brian. Sarah?
Yeah, so as a manufacturer, obviously, Mosaic and our competitors are energy intensive, we're trade exposed. And I think by having, the main mechanism be carbon tax, you're really forcing companies that have a global footprint of looking globally to where they're going to be making capital decisions, where they're going to be looking for increased production for the longevity of their business. And I think the shame is already many Canadian fertilizer manufacturers are already best in class. The potash industry, we have 50% less emissions on an intensity basis than our competitors in Eastern Europe. From an environmental justice point of view, we have, safe, cutting edge mines, and we're supporting local communities. We're already kind of doing kind of best in class engagement on all of our environmental portfolios. And so by having really stringent layering of environmental regulations on industries that are already world-class, it really forces those companies to look elsewhere. And I think it's just kind of a reality. And it's not unique to fertilizer manufacturing. I think we're seeing industry across Canada second guess investment decisions or figure out where else they want to operate. And so carbon knows no boundaries. So by pushing these investments into other countries, we're intensifying GHG emissions over here and just not keeping the jobs and economic value and technology in Canada. And so I think that when we're looking at different mechanisms for climate change public policy, the carbon tax and other environmental layering of regulations is going to have an impact for sure for a lot of different industries in Canada.
That's fascinating. Thank you. And from perspective from the beef industry around the implications of what the government's doing here and the implications back on your industry.
Yeah, no, good. Thanks. Good question, David. And I think it's already been hit on a few times. I would probably point on both working and not working towards that collaboration piece and working with industry. You heard it, Brian, I think said, industry's leading already. So I think the importance of government working with so that policies can be set that are relevant to industry and timely. This new carbon alliance that we've heard this week is maybe an indication of that process, starting to occur in terms of government and industry working together at the table. So the government can get the input that it needs to see what's working and not working. So I guess I again just circle back to that collaboration piece.
Good, thank you. So the next question is around, maybe looking at it from a continental perspective. We have a new Biden administration in the U.S., and there really seems to be two different approaches on both sides of the border. So the U.S. is looking more at penalizing heavy emitters and looking at agriculture as a storage solution. Agriculture is part of the solution here today. And in Canada, our system seems to be basing more around carbon taxes and putting the burden on industry, which includes farming. What are the implications of this being different on both sides of the border? Sarah, if you could start.
Yeah, so I think that it's early days to, see exactly what the United States is going to do from a climate change policy perspective. So far, the Biden administration has been signing a lot of executive orders. They've put a pause on a bunch of Trump era regulations from the EPA. The EPA has a plethora of political staff they have to still hire in order to move any of this forward. And so I think it's early days. I think early conversations would show that they're not thinking of a carbon tax, they're thinking of other mechanisms. And I think it's going to be interesting to watch on twofold is how their climate change policy, which they've said is a pillar for this administration, is going to play with their Buy America pillar. So, as they shorten their supply chains and look at bolstering US industries across the board, what does that mean for any sort of greenhouse gas emission sink or trying to regulate high emitters? So it will be interesting to see how those two things play out. I think the other thing that will really be playing out in the US is that the Trump administration had appointed over 200 federal judges. And often in the United States, things are litigated to a much more robust extent than they are on this side of the border. And so how will any sort of legislation play out on the judicial side is going to be, I think, something to watch as well. But I think that the US will eventually get to a place where, although, you know, the EPA is definitely going to be regulating industry, they're going to want industry to have a solid climate change plan. To Brian's point before, I think that they're going to rely much more on the persuasion rather than the regulation, and try to find a place to work with industry to get to net zero, rather than taxing and penalizing industry for their greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, it's sad to hear that the lawyers may come out the winner out of all this. And your perspective on that.
Well, I appreciated Sarah's background and comments to that. I think wearing the cattle producer hat, my comments or my concerns would certainly be mostly around the competitive disadvantage that occurs. Anytime we get a thickening of the border, no matter what that might be, whether it's got an environmental lens to it or a trade lens or a protectionist type Buy America lens. So again, it's early, as Sarah said, we'll be watching this closely, but right off the bat, a producer is gonna look at or hear about the upcoming border adjustments or whatever might happen as a competitive disadvantage. That's the only way I can see it.
Brian, what's your perspective, or share your perspective, please, on both sides of the border and the implications back for us?
And thanks, David, for the question. Yeah, I think it's just been said, and I think you said in your intro remarks to the question, you know, like it really is agriculture is seen as an opportunity in the States. And I think that's very, very clear. And so they're looking for ways, you know, the government as well as industry, ways to make that, you know, take advantage of that opportunity. Whereas in Canada, we don't have that, at least, you know, until very recently anyways, we didn't see that really in terms of our, at least national greenhouse gas policy. So, you know, that really plays a big role. In some ways, it really means that we're going to have to, as an industry, look to see how can we play in the U.S. market, you know, because we can provide offsets to the U.S. We don't have to provide them in Canada. And then the voluntary systems over there. So, I mean, we may end up playing there differently, but I think, you know, yeah, I do see sort of the slowness of government policy to facilitate and enable agriculture to play a role, and then also in penalizing it as well in some ways is not, and it's also I think, you know, alienated a lot of the farm community, you know, from climate change in some ways too, because of what's seen as kind of policies that are sort of penalizing or putting agriculture in a less competitive position. So I think, you know, there's a lot of I'd say it's, compared to the U.S., it's not a good story in some ways for Canada. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Maybe one bit of a follow-up question in there. Since Sarah, you're working, you know, both sides of the border, could you share some perspective on how the farm groups, how farmers are looking at this issue? You know, from philosophically, is there an acceptance of a need to change, or is it pushback? What could you quickly share on that?
So I do think that I would agree with Brian that the U.S. sees agriculture as an opportunity and an industry that needs to be protected in a way that maybe we haven't caught up yet in Canada. I think that, you know, trade is going to be a big focus for the U.S. And under Trump, we saw huge farm subsidies, obviously, go to the U.S. farmer, and, you know, whether that continues going forward, or they're going to just rely on trade flows being opened up again to different regions, that kind of remains to be seen. But I do think that overall, the US is probably positioned and has a mindset where they want to protect their agriculture industry. And I think they also recognize that coming out of COVID, that there's a great opportunity to just have a renewed, sharper focus on their food supply chain and their domestic food supply chain. And I think that it's something that Canada needs to consider.
Yeah, thank you. So next question, we'll start with Anne here. So in light of these goals about the need to sustainably increase, our intensification of our productivity, so we can feed the world and not destroy it in the process, what main challenges, what would be the top challenges that your organization faces in striving to reach this goal?
Well, I suspect there's lots we could point to for challenges. There always seems to be. I do think one that keeps bubbling to the surface is the whole terms of land use and keeping. And this kind of came up on the conversation that we had in this webinar on Tuesday, in terms of the pressures on land use change. If you're in Eastern Canada, it could be the urban sprawl taking more grassland out of production. In the West here, it could be potentially, especially in the current economic environment we've got for crops, competition from crop conversion. So I think that's a big one, because some of the goals we've suggested is maintaining all the grasslands we have, and I think we're up against an uphill battle on that one.
Thank you, Brian. Any perspective to share on that?
Yeah, again, I think I think that challenge that there does need to be investment, certainly by the government, into how do we quantify these greenhouse gas emissions, especially for complex systems. I think we can do. We may have a good idea for individual practices, but it's really complex systems where the innovation is going to come, and where we can maybe build systems that are completely better, and I think there's where we're just not putting the level of investment needed. And some of that definitely has to come from the public purse.
Okay, thank you. Next question, and we start with Anne here. So what would be the #1 research priority area to help your organization reach the goal, to reach these goals?
Well, I think first of all, right off the bat, it's going to be in terms of carbon sequestration. I think some of the things that Brian has certainly talked about, we need movement there in terms of supporting the sector and moving forward in getting to the point that we've kind of marked out. So whether it's through the science clusters, but those research pieces are integral to moving this. The measurement of carbon and the carbon sequestration, and advancing some of these the research around, can we really store more, or how do we go about storing more in these tame pastures that we have? So those are some of the, I think, the big challenges that we have, that we're going to need some research dollars to work with government moving this one forward.
Okay. Sarah?
I think that recognition that the egg sector is driving so much innovation and does have so many solutions now that could be broadened if we were just a little bit maybe more proactive as a government, recognizing it. I think back to my point on the benefits of the 4R nutrient stewardship, I think that it's kind of covers up a lot of things that this government says is important to them. There's like economic benefits, there's social benefits, and environmental benefits. So how do we kind of start to talk about it in a broader sense, and then legitimize some of these big, huge, like innovation buckets the egg sector is already looking at?
Brian, so from a sort of pan-prairie perspective, what do you think the #1 research priority area should be or could be?
Yeah, well, as I always said, I think the quantification, but just to say that again. And it has to be done in that systems context. So in some ways, this Living Labs initiative, or the AFC coming out with, is a good concept. I just think it needs to be much more expanded if we're going to move in the kind of timelines that we need to get better answers.
So maybe a follow-up question to that. You think about, these are big, complicated systems. So the quality of the measurements or the analytics around quantification, how robust is that system? Where do you think the gaps are? And where do you think it works well?
I think everyone seems to be very skeptical that we can't estimate these emissions, or somehow that things are very different than we think. I think we can do a pretty good job. I think where the gaps are probably where, these more complex systems. So, we may be able to do, cover crops, and we may have grazing, but now we start grazing cover crops, and that's part of now the grazing system, and how, so that changes, how land can be, used on the farm in terms of that the season, the grazing season and things. And so it causes other changes in the system, and predicting how that's all going to happen, or which would be to help manage and things. That's probably where, where it's just where it gets more complex. I don't think it's not something we can't do. It's just that we tend to think kind of individual practices instead of thinking, what happens if some of these things interact, and how do they interact? And I don't think it's impossible, but it's just obviously it's kind of you're moving it up to another level, and that's going to take more resources to get those kind of answers. But we need those kind of answers.
Yeah, it certainly is the ultimate systems analysis, huh?
And that's what it's about, really. It's about systems, right? I mean, we have to have systems production that meet all those sustainability goals, not just greenhouse gases, right? And as well as providing high production. So we're not going to solve it by individual practices, saying just cover crops are the solution. No, it's got to be much deeper and more fundamental than that. And we have to be looking ahead. How do we innovate to get to those kind of systems by 2050 that aren't even using fossil fuels at all? Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to switch now to questions from the audience, and so forgive me for needing to read, but so the first one here is from Gaetan Lucier, and maybe we'll start with Anne. And so the question is, do you believe that the government target of reduction below 2020 by 2030 is realistic? And if not, what would need to change?
Oh my. Well, again, I'm going to duck that a wee bit in terms of at the CRSB. We're a membership-based organization. A lot of our membership has set targets, has set goals, and so I think this came up earlier in terms of that's where our direction and our mandates are going in terms of what our membership goals have been set. Whether it's the Cargills or the McDonald's or the Loblaws or the Walmarts or the JBSs of the world, they're our membership base, and that's where where we're coming from, and they've all set these targets. So whether I don't think I have enough knowledge to say whether the government's target is or isn't, but certainly we're reacting and responding to what our membership targets have set, and they're giving us the direction as far as an organization. So I'll maybe cop out a little bit on that one.
Sarah?
So I think that the big concern for the fertilizer industry is the emissions intensity. So we're expected to increase food production and still decrease our footprint by 30%. And so there seems to be a bit of a disconnect there. And I think, as we move forward, the devil is really going to be in the details. And then also the, date of 2030, it seems far out, but really that's only 9 growing seasons for farmers to meet the target. And so I think that there's existing voluntary solutions such as the 4R protocol for farmers that needs to be prioritized. And then also, I think that some of the other things need to really, I mean, there's no replacement for some of the fertilizers farmers use. And so then I think the federal government has to start broadening their view on what can be done, and then be a little bit flexible with that target based on current science.
Thank you. Brian, can we do 2020 by 2030? And if not, what needs to change?
Well, I used to think some of these things were impossible, but then COVID comes along and they develop a vaccine within, 10 months. And they said before it used to take 10 years, and also, have major lifestyle changes like bang overnight, so it's not impossible. It's going to be difficult and it's going to hurt, I guess, in many ways. If we consider we want to, as humans, we want to kind of keep this we're comfortable with the way things are and want to keep that, and it's probably going to be different, but I think it's doable, but it's going to have to be very, very aggressive, and it's going to have to target, and it's going to have to put, every opportunity to get investment into where the emissions are. It may not necessarily be agriculture where there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in agriculture, but there's, other places it's probably, it's going to have to be involved too. You can't just focus on agriculture.
Okay. Next question. So in Brian's presentation, he showed in there that Bayer was going to Brazil and to the US to get the job done, so to speak. So, and we'll start with Sarah here. So what would it take to make Canada a place where companies can go to get the government job done in agriculture? They get the environmental job done in agriculture, sorry.
So I think for Mosaic, regulatory certainty is really top of mind. Over the last few years, we've had a lot of headwinds come at us, a ton of heavy lifting from a consultation point of view. And I think the government kind of has to roll up all of these things that they're looking at and actually try to put a cost or an industry impact to some of them. So when you look at something like an impact assessment, when you look at carbon tax, clean fuel standards, all of these things might just seem like one-offs, but when you actually roll them up for different industries, the impact is huge. And it also significantly shifts the ROI on investment decisions. And so Mosaic is also a company that now has a significant presence in Brazil. It's one of our biggest businesses right now. And so not to say that those investment decisions could have been made in Canada, but if you want to attract global companies to make significant capital decisions in your jurisdiction, you have to guarantee them some sort of regulatory stability.
Anne?
I think I maybe would suggest that, well, the industry already, as I showed in the goals update there, I mean, we're committed to reducing emissions here by 33% by 2030. So I'm not sure what it would take for outside companies are certainly supporting us. Those that are in the industry are certainly supporting that whole target and goal and reaching that goal. So it looks to me like industry companies have already just kind of taken ahead and moved without government in terms of setting goals here in Canada. So maybe that's one of the reasons why we weren't targeted there.
Brian, what would it take to make Canada go-to place?
Yeah, well, I think that regulatory certainty, because you don't want to be running an offset system at the same time. You're trying to do things through carbon taxes, because they're really they're can be two effective methods, I guess, but you don't want to have the two together probably. And so I think so when we're thinking through that regulatory and the mechanisms that you're going to use to incent it, and also I think that's I think and farmers, I mean, an industry is already, but inviting multinationals to come in and say, hey, we're a place that you can do business, from the farm community, because I think that's important. I think they already have that message, but I think it doesn't hurt to continue to make it.
Okay, next question. So what would be realistic for the private sector, like in processing and in retailing, to have a system of payment for the product based on positive results in GHG reduction. So I think the question is really, what would it take to have, or would it be realistic to have that kind of a payment of the product based on positive results?
Take a stab at that if you want.
Sure, Brian. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think it's I mean, I think it's realistic, but I don't know that that's a good approach. I mean, one thing is, like, if you're already doing a fantastic job, you're one of the best, most efficient producer, but you still have to make reductions in order to get this payment, where someone who's doing a horrible job can make quite easy changes and get this payment. I mean, in a sense, it could be done, but I don't think it's a good, private policy to have. And the other thing is, of course, you also have a lot of legacy effects, as we call it, particularly things like soil carbon. So if you have land that, you got land in your operation that is very degraded, you may have lots of opportunities to increase carbon, but you may have come on an old dairy farm, but you're into crop production. That's what you want to do, and so the land may be already very high in carbon, and it'd be almost impossible for you under a cropping system to increase that, for example. So you have these situations that doesn't, just saying pay for the reduction isn't really a fair way, and may not give you the results you want, and really incenting everyone to contribute as best they can.
Anne?
No, Brian answered that well. That's more than I could say.
Sarah, any perspective?
No, ditto. Brian handled it just perfect.
Okay. Well, Brian, okay. So a question targeted at Brian here actually would be, how amenable are the voluntary GHG offset market markers to using mark to measure values of sequestered carbon in short-term contracts?
Yeah, I was reading this. I'm not quite sure what mark to measure, what exactly is meant.
Yeah, mark to measure, maybe, or mark to market. I don't know if I'm reading that right, but it's got, I think providing a sort of a definitive updated value or a metric to go to measure against. Can it be a very dynamic system? Can it change, monthly or yearly, or is it kind of more of a fixed element that would be maybe have a longer lifespan to it?
I think this is maybe where, like you got, you'd have offsets that might be for emission reduction. So they're actually, reducing fossil fuel emissions, or reducing nitrous oxide emissions, or something. And then they can be very relaxed, I guess, in terms of the timing, right? Or you can show it in 1 month, 1 year, 1 day. If you can show that there's a reduction there, I think there's no real problem with that. I guess the challenge is with carbon sequestration. Then you really want to try to, even the voluntary markets are really wanting to make sure this is permanent. They recognize things can go up and down, and so I think there it's maybe a little bit more constraining to try to make it too dynamic. But I mean, as I said, it's a bit of the Wild West of the voluntary market. So I mean, if you can think of it, if you can develop a business case, someone, either you can take advantage of it, or someone else will take advantage of it for any kind of a system. So, yeah.
Okay. Then a question for everybody on the panel. So from the policy discussion we had sort of earlier, and looking sort of at the essence of it, that in the U.S. agriculture is part of the solution, and here we're looked at as part of the problem. So is that a correct assessment, Sarah?
So I think probably if any of our customers are on the line, they're going to say, no, there's so much work to be done on the US side too. You can't say that they've got it figured out. I will say what I noticed with conversations south of the border is that there is definitely a recognition that food and fertilizer are commodity businesses, and we do at some point have to drive profitability. So all of these discussions about environmental stewardship and GHG reductions are great, but at some point, if you want these things to thrive domestically, they have to be profitable. And I think that on the US side of the border, that there's maybe a bigger recognition of that than there is up here.
Anne?
I would say from the beef industry's perspective that both sides of the border, I don't know if I would call the US ahead or behind, but both sides of the border certainly need to work on changing that narrative in terms of the ag sector, the beef sector being part of that solutions provider for climate change mitigation. You hear it more now than ever before. Our sister organization, the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and of course we're all members of the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and there's no doubt the U.S. and Canada are leading the discussion on the beef side. But to say one is ahead of the other, but do we all have work to do in terms of changing that narrative and showcasing cattle production as stewards of the land and stewards for environmentalship? Absolutely, there's work to be done, but I'd almost call it even Steven.
So you think on both sides of the border? Well, the question really was around in Canada, are we part of the solution from a government perspective? Are we part of the solution? Are we part of the problem?
Well, I can't put words in their mouth, but that's the piece that we need to change, right? In terms of that solution piece. So I do think there's movement, like was pointed to earlier, in terms of that carbon alliance. I do think there's a broader understanding that we all need to be there to make those decisions. I would probably, that question is probably correct in the past, but I hope we're there for part of that solution going forward.
Good, thank you. Brian?
I would say that in many ways, the federal government is looking at agriculture as the problem, and you can see that a little bit in their targeted thing. We'll just target on fossil fuel, on fertilizer emissions, and have a quite aggressive target. Considering they also want to increase production at the same time. I mean, that's a very almost a penalizing target, perhaps, and so yeah, but I think it's coming around. And I think the other thing too is we have to realize that, I mean, we are in in terms of the U.S., Canada, I mean, we share so many things in terms of how we produce things, and a lot of even culturally, there's a lot of similarities. So I think, we need to work together, and I think there is a lot of collaboration, and certainly a lot of multinationals, of course, are working on both sides of the border. So I mean, I think that, I think we, instead of, we need to recognize that, and also take a look at what collaborations we can develop between countries, in addition to sort of just focusing on the differences.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, we're going to finish right on time with the panel discussion. So thank you very much, everybody. You did a great job, and those were fantastic insights. It's been a really, I think, valuable dialogue in terms of getting it raised, and I just sense a lot of opportunity in front of us to really be seen as part of the solution, and to think that today agriculture in the mind of the public is becoming more and more wanting to be understood and needing to be understood, and being a part of these solutions can be a great way to position our industry as something of the future, and really helping bring solutions to this great challenge. So with that, I'll pass it over back to Tyler McCann, the Chief Engagement Officer for CAPI, to say some final remarks.
Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. Again, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, our three panelists, and our moderator, David Dizziak, for their valuable insights. I'd also like to thank our sponsor for today's webinar, Fertilizer Canada. The themes that were addressed today, and important topics, are part of an ongoing dialogue and work that CAPI is doing on this important issue. And an upcoming virtual event that's quite exciting is going to be a joint event that CAPI is hosting with our counterparts in the U.S. Farm Foundation, which is going to be a virtual conference on trade and climate change that will be held this April 7th and 9th, 2021. Again, I think that these are important topics that are driving decisions and actions inside agriculture, and it's important that we have this discussion in the North American context. A link to the conference website for the Trade and Climate Change conference will be provided to all participants, along with a link to the recording of today's webinar. Now, finally, on the next slide, I just want to highlight again that the work that the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute undertakes is possible because of supporters like you and funders who believe in advancing the agriculture and agri-food sector. Of course, we greatly support and recognize the work, the funding that we get from the Government of Canada through Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, but there's so much opportunity to do more. There are many different ways to support the work of CAPI, as seen listed here, and we are actively seeking funding partners on our work going forward. Please reach out to CAPI to explore the different funding opportunities through the info email located at the bottom right of the screen. We look forward to connecting with you. And we look forward to seeing you again in April at our event being hosted in partnership with the US Farm Foundation. Thank you very much. Have a great day.